أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Verily, all praise is due to Allah. We praise Him, we seek His aid, and we ask for His forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evils of our own selves and from the evils of our own actions. And whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. And whomsoever Allah leads astray, none can guide back to the correct path. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We testify there is no deity worthy of our worship except for Allah, who is alone, with no partnership, there never has, and never will be another. And we bear witness that Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is the last and the final prophet of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. My brothers, my sisters, friends, and family, thank you so much again for joining us on our Monday halaqah. We will be on this day completing, now that we have finally hit that point, with the conclusionary notes of the Halal and the Haram by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. With that, I'll go ahead and open up. So the purpose of what the author was writing in regards for this book did not extend beyond the discussing of what is halal and what is haram in actions and outward behavior. As for the halal and the haram in the actions of the mind and the movements of the soul, it was not our intention to deal with them in this volume, even though such diseases of the soul, such as envy and covetousness, pride and arrogance, hypocrisy and ostentation, greed and lust are among the major sins in Islam. And Islam declares unrelenting war against those sorts of sins. And the Prophet ﷺ warned of their evil consequences, characterizing them as a disease of earlier nations and calling them the razor which shaves not the hair but religiosity. And anyone who studies the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ knows that the soundness of the heart and the integrity of the soul are considered the basis of success, both for the individual and for the society in this world and in the hereafter, as Allah mentions in Surah Al-Rad, the thunder, ayat 11. Indeed, Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. In and Ash-Shura, Surah Al-Shura, ayats 88 through 89, the day in which neither wealth nor sons will be of no avail except to the ones who brings to Allah a sound heart. And hence the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned that the halal is clear and the haram is clear. Between the two are doubtful matters. Whoever avoids them in order to safeguard his religion and honor it is safe, while whoever engages in a part of them may be doing something haram, like the one who grazes his animals near the himma. It is thus likely that some of his animals will stray into it. Truly, every king has a himma, and the himma of Allah is what He has prohibited. And as we mentioned beforehand, the himma is basically land that's not owned by, not only owned by you, but also owned by somebody of uh, great stature, such as a king or a lord of that time. So they're referencing that you're playing with fire, essentially. I mean, essentially and figuratively and realistically speaking. He then explained the value of the heart, the source of the emotions, the inclinations, and the intentions, which are the basis of all human behavior, referencing, of course, the heart, where the Prophet ﷺ said, in the body there is a piece of flesh, such that if it is sound, the whole body is sound, while if it is corrupted, the whole body is corrupted, and that is the heart. For the heart is the chief organ of the body and rules it. If the ruler is good, the subjects are good. But if the ruler becomes corrupt, the subjects then become corrupt. And in the scale of Allah, it is the heart and the intentions which then have weight, not the face or the tongue. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not look at your physical features, but He looks at your hearts, as the Prophet ﷺ has been mentioned in referencing. And deeds are judged by the intentions, and everyone will be judged according to what he intends. And such is the place of the actions of the heart and the affairs of the soul inside of Islam. However, because they relate to the character of the individual rather to what is lawful and what is prohibited, we have not dealt with them in this volume. And these inner aspects of Islam have been discussed by other scholars and by Muslim Sufis in great depth and detail. And they have referred to the moral and spiritual sins as diseases of the heart. And they have diagnosed their causes and have prescribed remedies for them in the light of the Book of Allah and the noble Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Imam al-Ghazali devoted one fourth of his encyclopedic work about Islam, Ihya Ulum ad-Din, to the topic, terming them as fatal diseases, since they lead a person to degradation in this world and to the fire in the hereafter. And another point to be noted as well is that we have dealt here only with sins of commission and not those of omission, although sins are of two kinds: doing one, or one of course being doing something that is forbidden, and doing something which is, or I'm sorry, not doing something which is obligatory. The second type of sin was not the subject matter of this book, although we have touched upon it, and there are some course of discussion regarding it. And we had aimed at describing the sins of omission, or had we aimed to describe the sins of omission, we would have been discussing an entirely different subject. We would have then been describing all the obligations which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has laid upon us as Muslims for unquestionably not doing them or neglecting them, therefore is haram. For example, seeking knowledge is an obligation on every Muslim, whether it's man or woman. If the Muslim keeps himself in the darkness of ignorance, he will commit sins through the lack of knowledge and consequently will not carry out his religious obligations, such as the prayer, the zakat, the fasting, and the hajj, which are the pillars of Islam, and is therefore not permissible for the Muslim to abandon them without a legitimate cause or excuse, since not to carry out them is a major sin, while to downgrade their value and to deny them is an abandonment in Islam. And to give another example for this regarding omission, it is an obligation on the Muslim Ummah to muster military power to the utmost extent of its capacity in order to defend itself and to keep the enemy of Allah and Islam at bay. And this is a general obligation on the entire community of Islam, and in particular, those who are at the helms of affairs. And accordingly, the neglect of such important obligation is a major sin and shame. And we could go on multiplying examples for that. But even for an example such as that, there's no such Islamic state or a reference of a khalifa whatsoever. And since the case of all other sorts of obligations, whether individual or collective, can and are similar in that sort of manner as well. So we do not claim to have covered the whole range of what is halal and what is haram in these sorts of pages. We have only highlighted the most important manners which are permissible or prohibited in the personal, family, and social life of the Muslim, especially those whose manners uh, are which people neglect and consider insignificant due to the ignorance of the reasons behind a prohibition or permission. And so we have attempted to show the deep wisdom of the Islamic Sharia in its legislations concerning the halal and the haram. So that anyone who possesses two eyes can observe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not arbitrary in his commandments, whether permitting things in order to be indulgent to people, nor prohibiting them in order to make their lives miserable. Rather, he has legislated for them what is in their own best interests, safeguarding their lives, their intellect, their properties, morals, and honors, and guiding them towards success in this world and the hereafter. And as we mentioned regarding even the first chapter, when we got into some of the fundamentals and the basis regarding the rulings that we were getting into, a lot of it stems from because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our creator, He is the all-knowing, all persevering. He is the one that knows what is going to be best for us, even if we as human beings see something that we do not feel is either correct or incorrect. And this is the way how we should be able to view a situation. Now, of course, in interest or intrigue, and we want to find some more of a I guess, referenceable or humanistic sort of approach in order to apply that or to understand it or to feel it deeper inside the heart, or even better, to make dawah to other people, by all means, there's nothing absolutely wrong with that at all. And sometimes that's even encouraged, as even mentioned earlier inside of this conclusionary remarks, that knowledge is obligatory. And but this is also the path in which allows Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy upon us and make the road to Jannah even easier. So in that sort of case, if we're doing those sorts of research for the sense of increasing our knowledge and getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will increase us in that. But continuing, all man-made laws are inherently, therefore, defective and in complete sense the lawmakers, whether they be individuals, governments, or legislators, limit themselves to dealing with the material considerations, the neglecting of demands of religion and morality. They are forever confined within the narrow bounds of nationalism and the interests of a sector of mankind, paying little attention to the world at large and to the wider concerns of humanity. They legislate for the present, not knowing what lies in their future, nor what the effects of their laws will be. Over and above all of this, legislators are human beings who are subject to their own weaknesses, desires, and prejudice. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah Al-Adhab, ayat 72, indeed, he, man, is unjust and ignorant. It is therefore not strange that man made laws can and are short sighted, shallow, and biased towards the material interest of the society, and that they provide only temporary remedies. It should not be surprising if human legislation concerning what is legal or illegal is to a great extent influenced by public opinion, by lobbyists, and by what is popular or unpopular. Accordingly, things are often made legal, even if it is known that they are extremely dangerous and evil in their consequences. And I think we can, one way or another, take a look at society and see what falls under this sort of line. One example of this may be sufficient. The government of the United States legalizes drinking of intoxicants, repealing the earlier legislation which had banned it. And the repeal of prohibition was enacted despite full knowledge of those evils and the harm which the consumption of intoxicants cause to individuals, families, and societies. And in contrast to this, the Sharia of Islam is free of all such defects. How could it be otherwise when it was legislated by the all knowing Creator, who is aware of his creatures, what is suitable for them, and what they are capable of? As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah Al-Baqarah, ayat 220, Allah knows the one who makes corruption from him who sets things right. And Surah Al-Mulk, ayat 14, should he not know who created all things, and he is a subtle, the aware. And this is the legislation of the all wise, powerful God. He did not prohibit anything unnecessarily, nor did he permit anything randomly. His creation is measured, and his laws are harmonious. And it is the legislation of this all merciful Lord that he desires ease for the human beings and does not desire hardship for them. So, how could it otherwise then be when he is more compassionate to his servants than the mothers who therefore bore him or bore them? And it is the legislation of the all powerful king. He is independent of his servants and is not partial to one race or to one generation, permitting to some what he prohibits to others. How could this be when he is the Lord of all beings? And this is what the Muslim believes concerning what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made halal and haram, and what he has legislated in relation to all other sorts of aspects. He therefore accepts it with a convinced mind, a contented heart, and with a strong determination to implement it in any way that he can. As the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned, if you cannot change an evil deed with your hand, you can change it with your tongue, and if not with your tongue, then you can at least hate it with your heart. And indeed, he believes that his happiness in this world and his success in the hereafter depend entirely upon observing the limits set by Allah, following his injunctions, and observing his prohibitions. In order to secure his happiness and success in both worlds, therefore, he must restrain himself from transgressing these sorts of limits. And in order to illustrate how observant the first generation of Muslims were in regard to the limits set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and how hard they strove to implement his commands, we cite two examples from their life before we close. And the first example is in our discussion concerning the prohibition of khamr, we mentioned how deeply the Arabs loved drinking intoxicants and how greatly they enjoyed their drinking parties. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gradually turned them away from drinking until he revealed the decisive verse prohibiting khamr totally and forever, calling it an abomination of shaitan's doing, as mentioned in Surah Al-Ma'idah, ayat 90. Therefore, the Prophet ﷺ forbade Muslims to drink khamr, to sell it, or to give it as a gift to non-Muslims. And when the Muslim heard about the prohibition of khamr, they at once brought out their stocks of intoxicants and poured them into the streets of Medina as a declaration that they had abandoned the drinking. And even more remarkable in expressing their total submission to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had legislated was the action of those who were engaged in drinking khamr when the verse, Surah Al-Ma'idah, ayat 91, will you not then desist, had reached them. Without hesitating for a moment, they threw whatever drinks were left in their glasses upon the ground, exclaiming, "O Lord, we have desisted." And when we compare this manifest success in combating and eradicating intoxicants from the Islamic society with the disastrous failure of the government compared to the United States, which decided one day to combat this evil by means of law and force, we cannot escape the obvious conclusion that the human beings do not reform themselves except by the means of the Sharia of Allah, which relies on the faith and the consciousness of the people before endeavoring to apply with authority and force. And the second example is this concerns the response of the first generation of Muslim women to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's prohibiting women the display of the adornment and enjoining of modesty and the covering of their awrah. During the period of Jahiliyyah, women used to go about with their hair, their necks, and their breasts uncovered, displaying the ornaments they wore, such as earrings and necklaces, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then prohibited the Muslim woman to this wanton display in the period of ignorance and commanded them to be different and distinguishable from the women of Jahiliyyah by observing modesty and by drawing their head coverings over their hair, neck, bosoms in order to conceal themselves. And the following are narrations from the mother of the believer, Aisha, radiallahu anha, concerning the manner in which the women of the Muhajirun and the Ansar received the divine injunction, which required a major change in their lifestyles, affecting their appearance, their dress, and ornamentation. And she said, "May Allah shower His mercy on the early women of the Muhajirun." When the verse, Surah An-Nur, ayat 31, that they should draw their head coverings over their bosoms, then referencing was revealed, they tore up their garments in order to cover themselves. So they had extra garments and they tore up their garments in order to cover themselves as was commanded at that time. And once starting at that time. Once when some women were in the company of Aisha, they mentioned the women of the Quraysh and their merits. Aisha remarked that the Qurayshi women were indeed good, but by Allah, I had seen no one better than the woman of the Ansar when applying the book of Allah, believing in the revelation. When the verse of Surah An-Nur, that they should draw their head coverings over their bosoms, as Allah SWT mentioned, was revealed, their men returned to their homes and recited it to their women. No sooner did the man recite it to his wife, his daughter, his sister, or any other female relative, then she tied any piece of cloth available to her, perhaps from a curtain, having pictures on it on her head, so that when they came to offer prayer behind the Prophet ﷺ, it looked as if crows were sitting on their heads. And this was the response of the believing women to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had legislated for them. They had hastened to implement what had been commanded to them and to abandon what he had prohibited without any sort of hesitation or stopping to think about it or any sort of waiting. They did not even delay a day or two so that they could get a suitable, soft piece of cloth and sew it to fit their heads or cover their bosoms. Rather, any cloth which was available, whether rough brightly colored, or even having pictures on it was sufficiently soft and befitting. And if no other cloth was found, they simply tore up the garments they were wearing and tied the strips to their head, not caring about their appearance, which, as the mother of the believers described it, resembled that of crows sitting on their head. And the point which the author and we wish to stress here is that the mere academic knowledge of the halal and the haram and the limits of these is not therefore sufficient. Although the major sins and the principal obligations are generally known to every Muslim, nonetheless, we find a great many of them indulging in these sorts of sins and neglecting other sorts of obligations and rushing towards the fire with their eyes wide open. And if the Muslim is well versed in the knowledge of his religion and its Sharia, and at the same time possesses a fully alert consciousness with safeguards the limits so that they cannot be overstepped, he is indeed rich in all sorts of goodness. And the Prophet ﷺ spoke the truth when he said, when Allah intends good for a person, he makes his own soul a watcher over him. And we end our book with the following supplication, which has come to us from the early Muslims. O Allah, make us independent in your of your haram with your halal. Let me return to that. O Allah, make us independent of your haram with your halal, of disobedience to you with obedience to you, and of any other than you with your bounty. All praise is due to Allah, who has guided us to this, and He not given us guidance, we would not have been guided. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you who have watched or are watching now. May Allah increase all of us so that we can be of those who say that we hear and we obey, and we are able to utilize this sort of knowledge in a beneficial means so that we can get more reward on the day of judgment and a higher ranking in the means of paradise. I mean, and with that, we close for the final reading of the book of the Halal and the Haram, and we will be continuing in the following month of the Gregorian New Year with a new book. So please stay tuned, and we hope to see you at the same time. Allahumma subhanaka wa bihamdi ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.